Hi, I'm Helen Walton. I'm Chief Commercial Officer and one of the founders at G Games. We deliver a variety of games to the iGaming industry, and at the moment we're working on multiplayer slots.
Hi, my name's Kevin Dale. I'm CEO of eGamingMonitor.com. I've been 20 years in the industry, marketing director at the likes of Betfair and Sporting Bet, and CEO at Game Accounts, GAM PLC. And eGaming Monitor, we monitor games, 30,000 games across 1,200 operators from 1,200 suppliers.
I think the first thing to say about regulatory pressure and design is that designers design faster than regulators regulate. So there's almost always a way around or through the regulation, and that I think can be problematic for the regulators, because if they're not saying what they want the objective or the outcome to be, and if they're getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of features, then quite soon you find designers finding sort of clever ways around the nitty-gritty in order to get to the objective that they want, which is for their players to be enjoying themselves, which often means good winnings or a good rate of winnings, and for them to be making money and their operators to be making money. So I think how regulators regulate is a kind of important part of how designers then respond to what regulators are doing.
I tend to agree with that. And I think you once said, Helen, in one of the sessions, I was a regular groupie of yours, as you know. One of your sessions, you once said sort of that we're a bit like sort of species, really, as companies, aren't we? We sort of adapt to the environment, and it's exactly what we have to do: is adapt or die. So, I suppose we're going to be looking forward to things like sort of vomiting unicorns, in brackets Germany, as opposed to vomiting unicorns other territories in the near future. Is that something that will happen?
Yeah, so I think actually, and species is probably a good analogy, because you will see people exploring different evolutionary niches. So there's attempting to do a kind of a one size fits all, and then you do a localization that's kind of as cheap and as easy as you can do. And then I think you'll get hyper specialization, where you get more niche companies that are designing for particular locales. So, Germany, I think, is quite a good example. Originally, and you're seeing less content for Germany at the moment, as suppliers are sort of struggling to figure out how they're going to make money from the new regulations and from what's happening there. But just for example, on the 5-second spin, you'll see companies who are just saying that there's 5 seconds between each time you press the button. And some of them are doing that by showing a little counter, which is kind of a little bit passive aggressive, sort of you're being kept waiting. It's not our choice to keep you waiting. Some of them are doing it by a longer spin speed. And some of them have been really pushing the regulator for further clarification. And actually, I think the most recent clarification that's come out, which says that it's an average of 5 seconds spin speed. Yeah. And therefore you can count bonus spins, and you can count maybe winning animations, and therefore you can reduce the time of the other spins. Well, that's actually quite complicated.
They're actually trying to define what a spin is, aren't they?
Exactly.
And that is the problem. If you're trying to sort of regulate down to the gory details of the mechanics of a game, things get a lot more complex, don't they? It sort of reminds me. I'm old enough to know sort of pre-internet days, and also sort of pre-single market, and I remember sort of back in the days. I was in the electrical goods industry, and if you were trying to ship something abroad, like a fruit machine or something that had sort of electrical components, you had to go and abide by different regulations in each of the different countries that you wanted to go into. And then you had to sort of make, obviously, different plugs on the end, and then you needed different sort of coin mechanisms and so on. And it was a real patchwork quilt. And then sort of along came the single market, and things were so much easier. Sort of effectively mutual recognition of standards and so on was there. And then along comes the internet, which was, everybody's heyday really for the last 20 years. And that was absolutely fantastic. And it sort of reminds me, this whole sort of micro management of, especially on the features that you're talking about, Helen, micromanagement of regulation of how it applies to actual game features is the thing that's really, really new recently. And that sort of reminds me of sort of building those machines and adapting them market by market. And it's a massive cost, I imagine, for you guys, really.
Yeah, it creates enormous margin squeeze. And I think it's closely linked to what will end up following on, which is that you'll see one set of companies, as I say, going for making things as global as they can, introducing games that are one size fits all and focusing on their most valuable market. So, for example, you see a lot of people who are focusing on bonus buy. It's the attractive feature that they want. It's what their VIP players want most. Well, it's not permitted in Germany or in the UK. And perhaps, therefore, those markets will start to look much less attractive to that type of operator, which, of course, opens up a little gap for a much more niche supplier to sneak in and do something very local there.
So, I mean, presumably it also means that you have to sort of build flexibility into the core of how sort of studios actually build technology, don't you?
Yeah, you have to build a framework.
I mean, in the old early internet days, I mean, it was all one size fits all largely, but you need a database of languages and currencies, and pretty much that was it. You snap it up there, and depending on the language that's sourcing, or the browser that's sourcing the game, the language and currencies and so on sort of adapted to. If you're to build the flexibility that it's looking like you might need to for the future, with spin durations, state minimums and maximums different, RTPs in particular being different, it's a very, very different back end, really, to actually building games, isn't it?
Well, you want this incredibly flexible framework that will future-proof you against regulatory changes, and you'll see a lot of suppliers boasting about how they have that. The problem with that, of course, is that I think it inhibits innovation, because it stops you experimenting. It means that you've kind of very rigidly defined what's the framework, what are the components that you need, and you're trying to make those as interchangeable as you can in order to cope with constantly updating and changing regulation.
That's interesting. I mean, we already from a eGaming monitor perspective, we already see, because we sort of pulled down all this data from 1,200 operators and 20,000 games or something. We're already seeing game names coming through with things like, I mean, I do love your game names. Not in your case, vomiting unicorns, but we do find sort of Dragon's Breath, sort of in brackets, 92% or whatever, as opposed to the Dragon's Breath game at 96% on a different site and so on. So we're already seeing how sort of almost third party like how companies are adapting and coping with this. But and we're also seeing equally what you're saying just now, which is that people are sort of steering clear of some markets too, because of the complexities of actually having to adapt. So,
and you wonder how players will react. So I think your most flexible VIP players will end up following the RTPs they want, the features they want, and never mind what the regulatory framework that they are inside says, and they will simply use a VPN and access content elsewhere. And there will also be a minority that are the kind of the opposite end, who are extremely happy in a highly known, highly respected brand name within the country, often perhaps the state lottery stroke state casino. And then there's a group in the middle that I think I feel that they're probably the least well served, because they're quite used to something. They've got very used to a huge variety of games. They're used to a certain RTP, and they're going to have a different experience. And yes, I think a worse experience than what they're used to.
I mean, when you talk of experience here, I mean, that's the key difference for me really at the moment, is that it's not, there's been regulation has happened, frequently. I mean, we're talking Europe now. The States is all happy stuff over there, isn't it? It's all regulation opening things out and land of opportunity. in Europe, it's largely been sort of regulation relating to advertising and sponsorship and what you can, how you can market your wares, especially from an operator perspective. The new types of regulation that we're seeing now is sort of really going to the heart of the product itself, the features and the values of the product. I suppose my issue there really is, when a customer, so it's the whole idea of how much of this market is going to be channelized through the regulator when the product itself isn't as valuable as it is offshore. I suppose that's my issue really at the moment. And if you can imagine sort of wandering into a pub and you get asked for your ID at the door. I don't, obviously, but many years ago you get asked for your ID at the door. Now you go into the same pub and they ask for to scan you in, which a couple of years ago would probably sound a bit far-fetched, but in COVID days, we've been there. And then you go up to the bar and there's a little sign saying, you have to sit down, and you'll probably remember, Helen, over in Barcelona, there was a couple of bars we weren't even allowed to stand up in a networking event. You think, and you'll see where I'm going here. And when the barman then says to you, okay, so show me the source of funds so that, I can check that you can even afford to buy, these drinks. It starts to become a sort of slightly unpleasant experience. So you get out your wallet and you pay for your drinks, and you find that he's served you beer that is 2% max proof, and whiskey that's sort of like 20% max proof, and you go, hang on a bit, this isn't quite right. And meanwhile, if you go down the road, you might have to walk a little bit further, and there's a sort of an underground speakeasy type place where you can wander in there. It's a little bit further. The toilet's a little bit dingy. You've had to buy some tokens somewhere because you can't use cash because it's not allowed. Not allowed to be a cash environment. But the beer is the original beer. It's the same brand, and yet it's 5% proof. The whiskey's its normal value. You're not being asked for ID left, right, and centre. And
that's why I'm saying there are a cohort of players who are absolutely prepared to make that journey, and there are a cohort who aren't, and it's the set in the middle that I think will get the worst experience. Of course, to a regulator, I suspect, kind of says, well, I don't care. I want to shut down the black market, and I don't mind if people have a worse experience because I'm concerned about other things. I'm concerned about a different level of protection. I kind of understand that, but the problem is I don't think they're capable of shutting down the grey or the black market. I think I think the global nature of the internet and the connected world. I'm not talking about black sites. I'm talking about being in Europe and being able to play on a perfectly well regulated site from Malta. That's not an illegal site, and that I think is the difficulty for a regulator, is that it's not even going down to a speakeasy. It's the difference between your local pub and being able to buy your beer in the supermarket.
Yeah.
And that's the world that we currently live within. Whereas I think regulators that focus more, and there are plenty of them who focus more on outcomes and who aren't getting into how long should the spin speed be, which I don't think are areas they really understand anyway, or what type of game, what is a slot, what is an instant, what's a single player bingo game, what are those games? Are they different? Are they the same? Is RNG different from pool? I really don't think that's where they should be going. I think, how much can people afford? What do we think is a reasonable loss limit per week or per month? What do we think is a reasonable deposit limit? I think those are much better questions to ask as a society and to then maybe regulate on.